Madam Speaker, it is with a heavy heart that I rise today to speak to this extremely important bill, Bill C-39, an act to amend the Criminal Code, Medical Assistance in Dying. Bill C-39 will delay by 1 year the inclusion of mental illness as a sole underlying condition for eligibility for accessing medical assistance in dying. Madam Speaker, I am truly disturbed by where we find ourselves as a country today. We were once a beacon of light to the world, offering hope, opportunity, community, and compassion to all. But we are quickly becoming a place where the darkness of death threatens the light of our nation. We're becoming a society that offers death as a solution to despair, a society that takes the easier, cheaper way out instead of the narrow, harder path. The narrow, compassionate path requires courage and hard work to create a path of support for those who are struggling and desperate for hope. When this government first introduced the medical assistance in dying regime in 2016, there was many who sounded the alarm, saying that this was a slippery slope, that this would open the doors to abuse, and that the vulnerable in society would pay the price with their life. But the government assured Canadians that this would never happen, and that there would be safeguards, and that these safeguards would be put in place, and that the criteria would be strict, and that the most vulnerable would always be protected. But here we are today, deliberating, extending assisted dying to those whose sole illness is one of mental health. This is sadly ironic, because during the last election campaign, the Liberals promised $4.5 billion in mental health funding, none of which we have yet to see. Our society has invested billions in embarking on awareness campaigns to bring dignity to those suffering from mental health issues. We have entire days dedicated to mental health. We have worked tirelessly in society to destigmatize mental health, and we voted unanimously in this House for a mental health hotline. And yet, here we are, contemplating how the government can legalize taking the life of a person who is lost in the depths of their mental illness. Madam Speaker, I believe deep down inside that we all are deeply disturbed by the idea that MAiD can be extended to the mentally ill. I believe that members of this House, of this government, know in their hearts that it is wrong for a government to abandon the most vulnerable among us in their time of need. They know it is wrong to promise mental health supports and then offer assisted dying instead. And what is sad, what is so sad, is that they try to justify it by saying it is only for those individuals whose mental health is incurable. But Madam Speaker, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, the loss of a loved one, broken families, broken relationships, the loss of a job, and the inability to support yourself, all these are real situations that many Canadians are now facing. And all these situations could propel an individual to the darkest depths of their soul. And when people find themselves in the depths of despair, lacking the support of friends and family, that this precise moment is when we see the importance of governments being the beacon of hope to provide support. Madam Speaker, the Minister of Justice assures us that those individuals who suffer from mental health and are suicidal will not be considered for MAiD. That statement is a tautological paradox. If a person is in the depths of mental illness and they want to end their life, by definition, they are suicidal. A person who cannot cope mentally and whose government has abandoned them and there is no prospect of obtaining help when that person decides to take their life, they are by definition not of sound mind. They do not have the mental capacity to give meaningful consent to ending their life. They are in desperate need of help. I say it another way. It is near impossible to separate those with suicidal ideations from those with irremediable mental health condition. 90% of people who commit suicide today, in fact, have diagnosable mental disorders. That is why it is utterly unconscionable that those who are suffering from mental health could in 1 year from now be offered death as treatment. Madam Speaker, this option will be abused in the future because MAiD has already been abused with few safeguards that are currently still in place. There have been countless stories of abuse, stories of elderly, disabled, marginalized, mentally ill Canadians, veterans even, who have fallen through the cracks of care and become victims of Canada's permissive MAiD regime. Here are some of the headlines across our country and across the world commenting on the MAiD regime. Hunger Games style social Darwinism. Why disability advocates are worried about new assisted suicide laws. The Toronto Star. Former Paralympian tells MPs, veterans, departments offered her assisted death. CBC News. Homeless, helpless man to seek medically assisted death. Barrie, Toronto. Normalizing death as treatment in Canada. Whose suicide do we prevent? Whose do we abet? World Medical Journal. What euthanasia has done to Canada. New York Times. Disturbing experts troubled by Canada's euthanasia laws. Associated Press. Why is Canada euthanizing the poor? The UK Spectator. Madam Speaker, this government needs to read those headlines and generally consider the totality of the evidence, because it is clear there is no way to safely expand MAiD to mental illness. This government heard evidence presented at the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying. They heard experts who said it is difficult, if not impossible, to determine if someone is suffering from mental illness and whether they will get better. Our country is in a mental health crisis. Record numbers of Canadians are struggling with mental health issues that have been exacerbated by COVID. To push forward with expansion at all is an abdication by this government of its responsibility to provide sufficient social and financial supports and sufficient suicide prevention and mental health support to our most vulnerable. To push forward with expansion at all is to abandon anyone who is suffering from mental illness. Madam Speaker, the darkest hour is just before the dawn. To those suffering with mental illness, we must be the hope of the dawn in the dark night of despair. We have the resources to wrap our arms around every single person in Canada suffering from mental health and to embrace and enfold them in the promise of a brighter future and one that invests in life and dignity for all Canadians.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Charlottetown.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I have 3 questions for the Honourable Member. Does she understand that someone that doesn't have the capacity to make a decision regarding MAiD is ineligible for MAiD? Secondly, does she understand that in order for someone to be eligible for MAiD, they must be informed of available and appropriate means to relieve their suffering, including counseling services, mental health and disability support services, community services, and palliative care, and must be offered consultations with professionals who provide these services? Is she aware that in order for someone to be eligible for MAiD, they and the practitioners must have discussed reasonable and available means to relieve the person's suffering, and agree that the person has seriously considered those means. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Member for Haldimand Norfolk.
Thank you, my honourable friend, for that question. And I hope my honourable friend is aware of the simple fact that those who are suffering from mental illness and those who are in the darkest part of their life and those whose government has abandoned them do not have the capacity to choose MAiD because they're in need of desperate help that their government needs to provide. Those individuals need life help over assisted dying.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Bay James, rather. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I heard my colleague's speech. I don't agree entirely with her principles, or not at all, because she stressed that it was an easy choice. But it's not an easy choice to take MAiD. It's a question of dignity. For 5 years at the Bloc, we have been working with consultations on MAiD because we think it's a right to die in dignity, with free arbitrage and with the least amount of suffering possible. So I don't agree. When we have to support people who are very sick, yes, support that they have perhaps is made with their loved ones around them.
For Haldimand Norfolk.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I did not speak today, Madam Speaker, about individuals who are on artificial means and at the end of life. I did not speak about individuals who had living will directives. What I spoke about was the extension of MAiD to those who are mentally incapable and the abdication of this government in providing the necessary supports to help those who are most vulnerable make the decision to continue a life in dignity.
Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. One of the ways that we can help people who are suffering and who may at some point consider medical assistance in dying is by supporting the establishment of a Canada Disability Benefit and supporting the level of income that that benefit would deliver to be something that raises people out of poverty. So New Democrats have suggested, for instance, that the level of that benefit should be set at $2,200 a month to ensure that people living with disability actually have the means to live with dignity, to afford a roof over their head, to afford to be able to feed themselves and their families. Is this something that the member supports?
Yeah. For Haldimand Norfolk.
Thank you to my honourable colleague for that question. Conservatives supporting our most vulnerable, and we believe that amongst those are those individuals who are suffering from mental health, and they deserve all of the supports that are needed to help them get through this dark time in their life. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to follow up on the question from the member for Elmwood-Transcona, because we have many speakers, members in this place who are talking about ensuring that people deserve a dignified life, and people with disabilities certainly deserve that. There's an important call for the governing party to fund the Canada Disability Benefit. Does the member for Haldimand Norfolk join us in that call?
Honourable Member for Haldimand Norfolk.
I thank my honourable colleague for his concern and compassion over the most vulnerable. And I say that the most pressing thing right now, in order to make sure that MAiD is not extended to those with mental health, is to make sure that the Liberals live up to their promise of caring for those with mental health, and that is not through providing assisted dying.